Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?
Please take your seats and fasten your seatbelts.
Flight crew, please prepare for takeoff.
Flight 229, you're clear for departure.
Thank you and enjoy your flight.
Hello, everyone. My name is Graham Mann, and this is the Business Aviation Podcast. On this podcast, we interview business aviation professionals with all sorts of backgrounds to learn about experiences, tips, and best practices to be successful. Today's guest is Joe Zvada, who is currently Vice President at Ultimate Jetcharters. Joe is a graduate of Kent State University, where he did his Bachelor of Business Administration in Aviation and Airway Management and Operations. Joe's been with Ultimate Jet for almost 10 years and started there doing data entry, entering actual flight times into the computer system. He grew into the position of lead flight coordinator and then operations manager, where he was responsible for all scheduling and operational logistics of Ultimate's fleet movements. This past June, he was promoted to vice president, where his focus has been on improving cross-departmental communication and workflow, as well as the short and long-term network planning for the Ultimate Air Shuttle program. In his spare time, Joe's a competitive hot air balloon pilot, and he's competed all over the world representing the United States. Joe and I share a love for optimization and efficiency, and we get into depth on how Joe has incorporated that into his work at Ultimate, as well as some of the things he's learned from ballooning that apply to his work, and his advice for newcomers to the aviation world. Make sure to check out the show notes for details and links from the conversation at leansystems.co/blog. Without further ado, enjoy this chat with Joe Zvada. Hey Joe, thanks for being here today.
Hey Graham, thanks for having me.
So before we get into, plane-related aviation, I've got to start with one of your hobbies because I find it extremely fascinating. You spend your spare time flying hot air balloons. How does one get into flying hot air balloons?
Well, for me, it was a sort of a childhood obsession, like dinosaurs or something like that I never grew out of. I just have been really interested in them since I was, like 4 or 5. And that sort of grew into me getting my license at, when the earliest you could, 16 years old. And I've been flying ever since. And I don't know. It's just a lot of fun. An adventure, flying activity kind of combines two things that I have a passion for.
I think it's amazing. So you mentioned qualifications. Have you done a private pilot's license? I mean, you're familiar, I'm sure, with a lot of that training.
Yeah, I have a fixed wing private pilot license for airplanes, and then I have a commercial license for balloons. And balloons, they have private and commercial.
So how do the two flying planes and the training for flying balloons, how are they similar and how are they different?
Well, they're similar in that, we're all sort of bound to the same regulations when it comes to airspace and stuff like that. So there's a lot of, in the balloon, it's more of a glance, I guess, because we don't, you don't get too in depth as you would in an airplane because you're not flying. You're generally flying in uncontrolled, uncongested airspace. So, you just need to kind of know that stuff to pass the test. So that's where they share some elements there. Where they're different is, just from start to finish on the flying side. First of all, the balloon, it only takes 10 hours of flight training to get checked out for your private license, whereas an airplane is 40 hours. I think it was 40 hours at least when I did it. So considerable less time commitment because there's, less to learn in a lot of ways. But at the same time, it can be just as challenging because you're sort of there's a lot of flying by feel and we don't have a lot of instrumentation at all. So it's kind of getting that feel. And usually it takes more than the 10-hour minimum, but that's all it requires.
I was going to say, it almost seems, from a personal perspective at least, seems more dangerous, I guess, because you're more exposed and so on. But I guess it's simpler in operation.
Yeah, operation is, it's a little, there's less things that can go wrong when it comes to, the mechanics of the burner and in the envelope like that. You're not really going to have a malfunction with today's technology in the aircraft. And they're pretty forgiving. If you do screw up and you happen to hit the ground too hard, the baskets are made out of wicker, so they absorb a lot of shock. They're purpose built that way, so the wicker will absorb some of the impact as you hit the ground and kind of drag if it's windy. And if you brush up against trees, you might get a few punctures in your fabric, but it doesn't pop or anything like that. So it's you get those replaced before you fly again, and it's pretty forgiving, especially for someone learning. Now there's more and more training as you get into bigger balloons when you if you're carrying passengers for hire and stuff like that, because some of the biggest balloons in the U.S. I think are 23, 24 passenger balloons, and in other parts of the world they fly even bigger. So you really, it's a whole different animal. When you get to that.
Yeah,
I've not flown that size.
I had no idea.
Yeah, just massive.
But you've done competition as well as flying privately, and I watched some of the videos. There's a couple of videos which I'll have to link in the post of you in particular flying, and I got sort of a sense of what a competition might look like. But what is a hot air ballooning competition typically consist of?
Yeah, that's really been my, if there's a subset of balloonists, which is a small group anyways, then, there's competitors where we, which has been my focus, especially the last 5 or 6 years. That's when I get a chance to fly balloons, it's 95% of the time it's in some kind of competition. And what we do, it's precision flying. So tasks. So in a given flight, officials may set 3, 4, or 5 tasks, which are just in most cases targets. So they'll pick a waypoint, which is usually a field, and they'll put fabric X in the middle of this field where we have coordinates to, and we try to navigate to this X, to this target, using only the winds. So we climb up to get a direction that may take us more to the south, for example, and you come down and it might take us more to the east. And we use those different wind layers to steer to the X. So the goal is to be as low and as close to the X as you can when you pass, because when our goal is we have a fabric, that's a beanbag marker, competition marker with a fabric streamer on it, and that is what we throw to the X, and the closest to the center of the X wins the task. And there's a point system where you accumulate points over a set number of tasks in a flight, and then over the number of flights during a competition might be a week long. So that's how we establish a champion. The one with the most points is the winner at the end. So the goal is to use the winds to sort of place yourself just a few feet above the ground, right over the X. So you're just sort of dropping the beanbag right in the center.
Wow. Okay. That makes sense.
And it's not an easy thing to do, but at the top competitions, like at the World Championships, you may have a field of 100 competitors. You may have 50 of them. You may have half of them within a meter or 2 meters from the center of the target. So we're talking centimeters that can mean the difference between getting 1,000 points, which is the top score, and to getting something considerably less.
Wow. That's amazing. It's hard to believe that you're able to utilize just the wind currents and end up getting that close on multiple targets. But I guess that's the challenge of it.
That is the challenge of it. Yep.
And you've competed, correct me if I'm wrong, for the U.S. national team?
Yeah, I've qualified. So there's a qualification cycle, though. The World Championships are held every 2 years, in even number years currently. And so we qualify for that at our U.S. National Championships, they, we take the top finishers from our, 2 preceding national championships going into the next Worlds cycle. So I've qualified in how many invitations the U.S. gets is, there's a long bylaws of how that's determined, but it varies. So the U.S. usually gets around 8 or 10 invites, and I've qualified I qualified in 2008, 2014, 2008, 2012, 2014, and last year, 2016. I was on the U.S. team.
Congratulations. And
thank you.
As part of that, you've flown in some pretty amazing places as well. Tell me a little bit about those.
The Worlds, they rotate cities and countries bid on them around the world. So my first was in Austria. And then 2012 was actually here in Battle Creek, Michigan. And then last year I flew in Saga, Japan. For the World Championships in 2016, and then we had in 2015 we had a World Air Games, which is separate from the World Championship. Is just ballooning discipline by itself. The World Air Games is it's like the Olympics of air sports. So they held that in Dubai in December of 2015, and they have everything from aerobatics to soaring to skydiving, paragliding, paramotor, all the different disciplines of air sports. They even had aero modeling, RC planes and stuff like that. So ballooning was part of that. I competed in that as well in Dubai a couple of years ago.
Wow, that's awesome. I'm sure it's fascinating to see the World Air Games in particular, just so many different disciplines related to aviation that you wouldn't necessarily know about before.
Yeah, that was really cool. It was a great environment. They had the Skydive Dubai is like an airport that they built near the Palm Island. People have probably seen that on television or whatever. But it's right by the Dubai Marina, which is this real built up area, and but it's sort of served as an Olympic village almost or equivalent. And they had several of the events there. We launched there a couple times, but you could go there. It was a 2-week long. We were there for a little over 2 weeks, and you could go there every day and see a different competition from different disciplines. And it was really cool to get to know some of the other competitors doing things that you didn't really even know that there was 2 people doing, let alone a whole sort of sport that was competing in it. So that was really cool to get to know people from around the world.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I find the whole thing extremely fascinating. Maybe I'll be able to get out next time I'm in Ohio.
Yeah, come on down. It's in the summertime.
Summertime only. Okay, I'll keep note of that. So we'll get back to aviation now. You started your career. Well, before you started your career, you went to Kent State and you did study a field related to aviation.
I did. Yeah, my major was aviation management at Kent State.
And you mentioned with ballooning, it was kind of a childhood passion. So I'm guessing that was what spurred you to go into aviation in college?
Yeah. Always been interested in all forms of aviation. My dad's in aviation as his career. So, I was kind of following in those footsteps and went to Kent State. It was they have a good aviation program that's only gotten better since I was there. But with the aviation management degree, that was about half the time I spent in the aviation college and the other half in the business college. During my 4 years there.
And did the particular part of aviation that you were interested in change as you went through college, or you knew going in that you wanted to study a specific area?
It did change. Yeah, no, I always thought I would be a pilot. And then I sort of got in it and sort of shifted focus to more of the business aspect of of the industry, and part of that was just the cost of flight training. But I've always sort of been attracted to business of any kind. So when I got into that, it definitely attracted me away from the flying and into the business side.
And was there a specific moment where you realized, oh, okay, I want to go into business, or it was sort of a gradual progression as you did more business courses, or just as you studied more?
It was probably when I saw how much the flight training would cost.
Okay.
And, I was probably already leaning. I know I was already leaning. And then that was just like, yeah, well, forget this. I'm not spending that much money. And at the time, you couldn't buy a job as a airplane pilot. The industry was right now there's a pilot shortage, so there's all kinds of opportunities for pilots. But at that time, there was, it was hard to come by a job of any kind, and most of the ones you could come by didn't really pay that much. So, that was probably the moment where I was like, made the decision to focus on away from the flying part of it.
Yeah, the fluctuations in the pilot market are fascinating, but as you say, for a long time, the job prospects weren't that rosy.
Yeah,
coming out, and even if you did manage to get a job, as you say, it was low pay or bad hours, etc. So it's interesting how that changes over time.
But those who have stuck it out really have a lot of good opportunities right now, and probably will for the next 5 or 6 years at least.
Yeah, that's true. So you graduated from Kent State, and then you started right away at Ultimate Jet?
I went to flight options in Cleveland, Ohio, a fractional, smaller. They're smaller than what we have, smaller jets. They have more planes, but just smaller capacity aircraft than what we have at Ultimate. But I was only there about 8 or 9 months, I guess, just under a year, and they went through. It was that's right when the beginnings of the recession were happening, so they went through some downsizing of the workforce. So, being the last one to go in, I was the first one to go out.
Right. Yeah. Fortunately, that's often how it works.
Yeah.
So that job search process, did you start as soon as you graduated, and what did it look like in terms of how you got that job and the process you went through?
It was really networking, and I wasn't even. I didn't. I had no network directly at Flight Options, but I was, through a friend of a friend, or I had somebody gave some advice. Check out this company. I know somebody that works there, or whatever the case was, and that's how I found them. And they happened to be. I put it in my resume or gave them a call or something like that, and it just happened to have be good timing. They were hiring at that time.
Okay, and did the person who recommended you check them out, did they put in a word for you, or?
No, they didn't have that well of a connection. It was just more of a sort of hey, check these people out.
Right. And did you do that with multiple other companies as well, or this was the only one?
Yeah, I definitely did. The other ones were probably more just, searching online and finding them through job posting sites. I don't remember specifically, but I did get the job fairly quickly with Flight Options after I graduated. It was there was not a lot of time between graduation and
right.
when I took the job.
And you mentioned networking was really the source of the job. Where did you network, and what sort of activities were you doing to help your network?
It must have been through I was involved in a couple clubs and programs at school, and it must have just been through connections like that. And I don't remember specifically if it was another classmate that made the suggestion, or if it was somebody that came in to speak at a university event or something like that. I don't remember.
And which clubs were you involved in? Just out of curiosity.
I was involved in AAAE, which is Airport Association. I don't know what it stands for, but airport operations, airport managers, stuff like that. I was involved in that, and that was the main one. I did a lot through them. We went to did a couple trips, over the years to tour different airports and involved, bringing people in to speak and roundtables and stuff like that. So that was the main one I was involved in.
Okay, cool. So after flight options, the recession hit, but you started fairly quickly at Ultimate Jet, right?
Yeah, I did. I think I left flight options in end of May, 1st of June, around that time, and then started at Ultimate in July of that year. So just a month later or so. And
how did that job come about, or what did that process in terms of looking for a job look like?
A friend of a friend recommended that I give Ultimate a call. They were, at the time, they had just gone from scheduling, the fleet. They got their first scheduling software, and they sort of needed somebody else. Really, I was hired just for data entry to put in and verify flight times from the previous day's flights into the system for tracking purposes. So it was a very, very entry level position.
Right. And the average day, what did that look like for you in that position?
It was an 8 to 5 deal, and I just would go in and collect the flight logs from the previous day's trips or those days' trips if they finished up earlier in the day, and take that info, which was submitted basically on paper from the flight crews into the scheduling software for tracking purposes. Okay,
but you didn't stay entry level for too long.
No, it sort of grew into I just started trying to help out as much as I could, and just started taking on more and more and helping the operations team with the dispatch and whatever, really doing whatever anybody needed. And it came eventually became the lead of the department, which is sort of at the time is kind of misleading because it was a department of one for about a year. I was by myself. We had some turnover, and we just kept it bare bones because it was still in the recession. So, we were, just watching our cost at all times. So yeah, for about a year, probably more than a year, I was a one-person show.
Still counts as head of the department.
Yeah. So, but then we came out of that and have really grown so I was just barely getting by with, whatever was needed to just keep the fleet moving. And so we've expanded the team's, duties and responsibilities, and really made, the product that the department puts out a lot better over the years. And with that has come, new hires. We now have a team of 5 or 6 people in there that really do a great job of keeping the planes moving, and we were able to do that, sort of justify that because of the increased capabilities of what we could get out of the operations team from things like scheduling the fleet more efficiently by giving our team members more time to just study that and do it, and things like fuel negotiations and all that kind of stuff. Crew travel, we travel all of our crews to the aircraft. So if we can find some efficiencies through that, then that all has a major impact on our bottom line.
Sure. So there's a couple of things I just want to dig into there a little bit. You mentioned you helped out with whatever you could in the early days. What were some examples of things you'd offer to help out with? And when you offered to do that, was it you offered to your manager to do specific things? You offered in general? You just did them?
I'd say it's probably a combination of all. I definitely offered more often than not, but if there were some things that I just took initiative on and that I thought could be and maybe would do it and then offer it as hey, I did this. Do you think it's helpful? That kind of thing. And more often than not, it was. And if it wasn't a big deal. I just didn't do it again.
Yeah, I find that super interesting. So what were some examples of some things you might take initiative on and do?
Definitely a lot of the scheduling of the fleet and finding some routing optimizations. That's sort of that has really been my focus over the years, and that's sort of where it started. I would be looking at the schedule all day long, so I would see, if we move this here and this here and this here, it could save us a few tenths of flight time or an hour of flight time, and just make those suggestions of, hey, do you think this would work, and would it be a benefit, and if it won't work, why? So I can understand that too. What are the rules here that we're playing with? So that's the big thing. And then anything else, if someone was overworked and having a busy day, just offering to take stuff off their plate, grabbing the phone. If somebody, we share an office there with at the time with the everybody and that was involved in operations. So if the phone was ringing off the hook, I'd answer and try to help as best I could, and if not, just try to filter some of the calls to help prioritize for the team to deal with what was needed and make sure we get back to those that we need to follow up with. So that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, I think that's fantastic. And that's very interesting, sort of doing the work ahead of time and then learning from what you've presented is, I think,
with a conscious, I've always presented it in a way that, I wasn't stealing any work from anybody. It was all sort of new things that I would just try. I ended up having some time on my hands because the data entry, didn't take my whole day all the time. So I had some time to fill. And in that time, I would also do things, like, check the weather, a day or 2 days out. And, this time of year, especially in the wintertime, watch the snowstorms and try to get aircraft on hangar lists so we could avoid de-icing where needed, that kind of stuff. So I did that a lot.
Right. And then the second thing was, obviously your responsibilities changed when you moved into the lead scheduler role. So what did that role look like? What did a typical day look like, and what sort of responsibilities did you then have in that role?
Well, as lead scheduler, I was responsible for basically everything logistically involved with the movement of the aircraft on a daily basis and the crew on a daily basis. So I built the aircraft schedules, from our revenue trips, and tried to, find the most efficient way, which I didn't have a lot of time to spend on that at the time. And then crewing the planes, make sure, crews had duty time to complete the trips. And then on, we work on an 8-day on, 6-day off rotation for the crews. So every Wednesday we are swapping out our crew members. And, so I was coordinating all those airline tickets and everything like that for the crews to come in and out from their work rotations.
Right. And did any work habits or I guess methods of working transfer between the data entry role and the new role as lead scheduler?
Well, I definitely learned the software as the data enterer, data entry position. So that helped. There was no learning curve just in the tools that we were using. And I also learned, how to read the schedule and got familiar with where we were going and that kind of stuff. So it really was a good introduction to the operations of the company, that made the transition a little smoother.
Right. And you've recently moved up again. You're now VP. Congratulations on that.
I am. Thank you very much.
How has your role changed again this time with the change in position?
Well, so far I've been focusing on how we can work together better, across departments and find efficiencies, and really applying that same optimization mindset that I applied to the schedule and still do. I'm still very much involved in that process with scheduling the aircraft, but trying to streamline our processes where able, across different departments and, in the company, and learning what other people do and how, what operations does that sort of, has effects down the line in different departments, like accounting and payables and stuff like that, and what a small change upstream can make it a lot easier for the team members in another department downstream, and vice versa. The other way around too. Like from sales, where our trips come in, they come from there to dispatch. So what can we do to sort of make that a smoother process?
Can you give an example of a process that you examined or looked at and found an inefficiency in, and then what you did to change to try and improve that?
It's a lot of the biggest changes is streamlining communication, and a good example of that is through delay. When we have a delay for weather, or air traffic control, something like that, getting that from our operations team to our reservations customer service team in a quick, efficient, and complete way. So they have a complete, our customer service has a complete view or knowledge of the situation, so that they can then proactively communicate that to customers who are impacted, and then also reactively respond to any questions that further questions that a customer may have if they call in and have want to know further information about what's going on. So we always did that, but we're sort of cleaning it up, streamlining it, and trying to be more proactive and complete in the whole process to give the customer just make sure we get as much information as accurately and as quickly as possible to the customer that's affected.
And does that typically include changing responsibilities for who's communicating the information, or changing the actual information that's being transmitted, or changing the tools that are transmitting the information, or some combination of all three?
Yeah, some combination. It's a lot of education, because our ops, when information gets kicked around in ops, whether it's between crew and dispatch, or dispatch and maintenance, it's very there's a aviation lingo and vocabulary terminology that our customer service team then needs to sort of know and understand, and then translate into something, make sure that it's fully comprehended by the customer, who then gets it at the end. So we're doing a lot of between the two departments, trying to learn what a customer needs most in that critical moment when they are finding out that their plane may be delayed because of a weather situation, and then what the operations team knows and when, and how that gets over to reservations in a way that they can understand, and then move on to the customer.
Right. So it sounds like a lot of it is making sure that there's clear standards set for both how information is interpreted and making sure everyone understands it correctly, and then also how it's passed along from one department or person to the next, and making sure that's consistent.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So Ultimate Jet does a combination of scheduled shuttles and on-demand charters, and you're often involved in things like natural disaster response as well, correct?
Yeah, we are.
So how do you balance those two types, and which are each a bit different?
We've got about half the fleet that's on a scheduled shuttle service that is more or less hubbed out of Cincinnati, Ohio. We go to five cities on a daily basis, Monday through Friday. And then the other half of the fleet is on charter. And so yeah, we get with the hurricanes this fall, we did a lot of flights for in conjunction with that. Getting people out whose airlines were canceled at the last minute before the storms, and then after the storms, doing some helping out where we could get some people in. Sometimes we take transmission line personnel into areas like that. Other times we're taking more people out, that kind of stuff. For these hurricanes, we mostly did most of our work was before the storm, just getting people out of the way with who were the airlines, whatever the case, wherever they couldn't get out, without a charter. We stepped in at the last minute. We were, I think, we were the last, or if not the last, one of the last planes out of the Tampa area right before the hurricane came up the coast there. So that was, and that's a lot of logistics and trying to figure out who has fuel and how much fuel, and will we be able to get out? Do they still have power? That kind of stuff.
Wow. Yeah. So do you think the regularly scheduled flights, do they make it easier from a scheduling perspective compared to if you were completely charter?
Yeah, they do. Because we know where they're going Monday through Friday. But at the same time, it sort of creates some, we're bound to it. So we can't, there's no efficiencies or anything like that to pull out of it. There's no, our planes are there. So, it's not, we don't happen to have a plane, in Texas or wherever, you often get a trip request and, hey, look, we're well positioned for this one. We have to have a plane nearby. So that's not the case. So that makes it, a challenge at times because we're bound to those schedules. But for the most part, we know it's nice to know what we're doing, on so much of the planes, on a regular basis, Monday through Friday.
Yeah, that makes sense. You and I kind of hit it off chatting originally about optimization, and it's come up multiple times. I think it's clear that it's something you've been interested in a long time. And we talked about efficiency in communication, efficiency in scheduling. Where else in the business do you sort of view optimization or look at the part of the business from an optimization standpoint?
The scheduling is a big thing, but that's where we get the most optimization out of on a daily basis, and it's just a big piece of what we do, and that's constantly changing. So, if you set something up and then a trip adds or a trip cancels maybe, or a trip changes, and it, sort of changes the entire picture of what the whole fleet is doing during that period. So we have to take another look at it and make sure we're getting the most optimization out of that scenario. And then when the scenario changes, we have to sort of do it again and make sure we're always updating it. But besides the schedule of the aircraft, the schedule of the crew is a big source of optimization, trying to limit the number of airlines that we have to purchase airline tickets. And then or if we sometimes we can't get away from it. So picking and choosing where we send somebody. We have crew members who it might make sense to send here as opposed to here, because we look at the price of tickets and one's more expensive than the other. We can make changes like that to sort of pull some more efficiency out of it.
Right. So let's talk about scheduling, since it sounds like that's certainly the main aspect. What does the process look like from the time where you sit down to build a schedule to the time where you say, okay, we've reached the optimal schedule? And what are the steps along the way that get you towards that optimal schedule?
Well, it's just sort of ever evolving. So, it starts, when we look out several months, all that is probably on there is, our scheduled routes. And then as things get built in with charter trips and everything that fits around those schedule pieces, then, we just sort of, as each piece gets added, and we sort of learn different variables that are going to affect the schedule from that week, whether it's maintenance or weather or, whatever the case may be, possibility of a new trip. We just take a fresh look at it. And for us, it's just sort of taking pen to paper and trying different things, setting up one scenario, seeing how that adds up, and then going back to the original and maybe trying a different way and just seeing what makes the most sense. And it's not always about squeezing the most hours out of finding the most efficient from a flight time standpoint. We take into consideration other variables like high priority trips that we want to make sure that we have maybe we have a close backup on, or quality of life for the crew member. We're not going to load up a single cruise day of flying or multiple days of flying to just save, a few tenths of flight time. It's got to be, we make sure what we're doing, make sure we're not blinded by the operational efficiencies, and that we're taking a common sense look at, how we're operating from, sort of a human aspect as well.
Right. And you mentioned pen to paper. Is it typically literally pen to paper, or are there software tools that you also use?
Yeah, it's all in the software. I guess it's a little scratch pad. I keep track of total hours, I guess, on paper for different, if I'm working on a 5-day stretch, I'll map it out one way and say that, costs X amount of hours, and then map it out a different way, and that costs, X amount of hours, and see what the difference is, and is the difference worth making the change and make a decision.
What's the software you're using?
We use flight operating system or flight operating software, FOSS.
Right.
The Rockwell Collins.
And you track total flight hours. Are there any other important metrics that you track internally? I mean, you mentioned sort of qualitative ones like quality of life and so on, but are there any quantitative ones that you relate back to those, or it's more just feel?
Yeah, it's the flight time, and we're bound by the regulations. So sometimes we set up a scenario and then we dig into it and we run into an issue with, well, this crew can't do these 2 trips back to back because the duty time doesn't work. So that, that's a restriction and something we have to, we measure. So usually we set up like the aircraft, schedule, and then, apply the crew to it. And then we'll make changes, if we see, once we apply the crew to it, well, if we see that, boy, this crew's really getting hammered on these 2 days, what can we do to sort of make that better? Because, we make that better, not only is it better for the crew, but, we're more likely to be on time, or more likely to do a better job for the customer. And then, we'll also make changes going into a crew swap. So, we may spend a little bit of repo here and there, reposition flight time to make a crew swap better, either from airline cost standpoint, or just maybe quality of life for crew members, or sort of a risk reward. If a lot of times we may have a situation where we can decide between trying to get airlines to do a crew swap into somewhere way off the map out in Nebraska or South Dakota, where there aren't a lot of options, and high probability that there could be issues and delays and stuff if there's any weather whatsoever. And we may say, well, let's just bring it closer to more of a hub for to do the swap, or
Sure.
even if the home base is nearby, they're going to their next leg, we will route them out a little bit out of the way sometimes, if that's advantageous to us, to bring them in to home base, do the crew swap. And then you have maintenance that throws in variables. Planes need to work their way back on a regular basis, so we communicate with them and figure out what they need and figure out the best way to do that, and kind of put the whole picture together.
Sure. So when you're evaluating some of the qualitative things like crew quality of life, what's the timeline you're looking at? A week?
Yeah, we generally everything is in a week at the most, and sometimes it's just like Wednesday through Saturday.
Right.
Our schedule kind of flows in. That's sort of a good flow, because so a new crew starts on Wednesday, so we flow through the weekend, which can sometimes be our busiest time on the weekends. So we get through that, and then Monday, Tuesday are oftentimes a little slower. So we kind of do that separately, and then start all over again on the next Wednesday for the next weekend.
That makes sense. Okay, one last question, and then a few quicker ones to wrap up. I want to be respectful of your time.
Sure.
Are there any skills that you've developed in both hot air ballooning and your career that are applicable to the other? And if so, what are the ones that you found most valuable in both?
I would say sort of, I guess, stress management for myself. It can get, if we're dealing with a weather event in operations or anything like that, even a pop-up trip at the last minute can be very stressful. And, all the things that need to be done, you got to be able to prioritize, identify what needs done, and then prioritize, when you do the different tasks. And I've gotten a lot of that from what I do in ballooning with the competition. When you compete, you're managing, multiple variables. You're trying to fly the balloon, fly the targets, and deal with the weather, deal with other balloons in the air, because we're we fly very close a lot of times because we're all going to the same place. And I usually, at the World championship level, we travel with a fairly large team of 6 or 8 people. So we're managing all them and managing data from them during the flight and before the flight and all that kind of stuff. So really that has, and I was doing that long before I was doing, this to this level in the aviation operations. So that kind of gave me a fundamental of workload management and stressful situations that has definitely served me well over the years.
Right. And do you have any specific things you do or strategies when those situations arise to help deal with stress?
I have, I guess I try to slow everything down and make sure that I always take at least a moment to assess everything before, you start making snap decisions. If it requires quick decisions, then you got to make a quick decision, but you can take a moment and just, think everything through. And then if you have time or if you need to make time, walk away for 3 or 5 minute breather and come back to it. I can't tell you how many times I've done something like that, or you're getting pounded all day long to the point where you're like so laser focused on a certain part of your duties that you don't see anything else, and you walk away for a moment, and you come back, and suddenly it's like you come back with those fresh eyes, and you see 5 better ways to do what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I can sympathize with that.
Yeah, that's I guess I just sort of take things as they come, and don't get too high and don't get too low, and just keep taking one task at a time.
Right. And when you're thinking things through, like stepping back to take a moment, does that all take place in your own head, or you write things down? Or
I write a lot of things down. I notepad or scratch pads, or I have a dry erase board in my office that I use for all kinds of different things. But I will throw in an escalating situation. I'll throw up sort of the status of what's happening, and what needs to be done, and what are we waiting for, as 30 minutes till the next update from air traffic control, or whatever the case may be, and just sort of see it all up there on the dry erase board helps keep me organized.
Yeah, it's amazing what putting it down on paper or dry erase board or whatever it can seem to do for clarity of thinking.
Yep. And I delegate, now that we have a team, we can assign a couple people to deal with a situation, whatever it is, and then 1 or 2 people to sort of take everything else, keep everything, because we may have a situation that affects maybe a small portion of the fleet, maybe even only 1 fleet, or maybe doesn't affect any of the airplanes yet. It's we're trying to get a crew member to an aircraft, and he's dealing with an airline issue, traveling to the plane, something like that. So we can sort of isolate that and let people deal with that, and then now have somebody keep the other part of the team working to keep everything going as normal.
Right. Now, I just want to touch on that briefly. Delegation was obviously not something you had to do when you were Department of One.
Right.
How did you develop that skill naturally as you progressed into the role, or were there conscious things you had to do to develop that skill as the team grew?
I would say growing the team was the main motivator. One of them was to be able to delegate, just because there was too much, I just couldn't keep up. So it came pretty naturally, but I'm sure I was, there are things that I'm sure I was, and probably still am, reluctant to delegate. give up, or I guess. And when I try to recognize those things and make it a point to do that more. And, if I don't have, if I feel like I'm the only one that can do it, then I need to spend more time in training my teammates so that they can, be of equal, and everybody is, has the capability to do whatever is needed when they're on duty.
What's an example of something you were reluctant to give up on, and eventually you got to a level of comfort where you were okay handing it off?
The big thing is the scheduling. That is something that has sort of always been my deal. And as the team grew, everything else went to the team, or at least from a capability standpoint. We shared everything, but we shared all that, but I still kept the scheduling part of it. And that's a 24/7 job. If there's a pop-up charter trip or a weather event where we have to reroute airplanes or stuff like that, if you're the only one that can do the scheduling on that level, then you're going to be involved. So it's also the hardest thing to train. So, it wasn't all just me sort of hoarding it. It's also, I had to learn how to teach somebody to do it and, identify or explain, what's good, what's bad, what are my goals as I'm looking to schedule, what'll work, what doesn't work, that kind of stuff. So
yeah, it's often a revealing process too, because it's not until you actually go to teach someone else that you have to verbalize all the things that you've sort of learned over the years and done without thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
Why did I make this decision on the schedule?
Right. Yeah. And it's so fast paced at times that, especially, a few years ago, I would just be, we just move. So you're working on something, you do it, you set it and you move on. And then, to go back at a slower time and sort of analyze it with somebody and, say, I want to talk about, what was going through my mind when I made these decisions to get to this sort of scenario. And it's like, well, I had to learn how to remember what I was thinking, because I would be on to the next thing so often that I couldn't think back all the time.
I'm sure it was intuitive for you at that point too. So you weren't necessarily thinking through every step.
And there's so many variables that, going back, and timing is such a key thing when it comes to a lot of this stuff. When you're making a decision, so much of it depends on, the time, the time,
it's very contextual.
Yeah. So if you're making a decision at 2:00 in the afternoon on Thursday, you don't have information that you're going to have at 3:00. So, when you're going back on, the following Monday and say, man, you had, they opened the airport at 3. Why did you make the decision at 2 to do all this kind of reroute? Yeah. It's like, well, yeah, that's a good question. I wish I would have had that information.
Yeah.
So timing is such a major part of it, which is, it's hard to teach because you almost have to. And what I did was, instead of going back to use examples of what I've done in the past, in order to train, what I did was just bring the team on ahead of time and sort of take more time to walk through a future scenario and say, hey, here's what I'm looking at. Here's what I know the variables to be at this moment. And here's the decision I'm going to make with all that information.
Right. So you shifted from kind of like retroactive reviews to on the fly teaching.
Yeah. Future, always looking forward. Yeah. That seemed to help.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Awesome. We'll finish up with a couple of quick questions here. What's your dream place to fly a hot air balloon?
Oh man, I've had some, I've had some really cool, I had no idea that, flying in Dubai would be so much of a cool experience. But that is right now by far the best place that I've flown. So I guess that's what's cool about ballooning is it's hard to have a bucket list of places you want to fly because you're going to stumble on these places where at that moment in that place at that time that flight is so special that becomes
you don't
one
know
of the
before it happens.
best things you've ever done. Yeah.
Right. So, and this is a bit of an aside, but there must be a very specific set of weather conditions that allow ballooning.
Yes. Yeah. There's more things that keep us on the ground than let us fly.
So what's a quick rundown of good ballooning conditions or a good place?
Stable air, stable air mass, no convection or anything like that.
Right.
We need good visibility, decent visibility, because we got to see where we're going, and we need calm winds. There's no brakes in a balloon, so the only way to stop it is to just sort of come in and hit the ground.
Right. Calm winds meaning what sort of wind range?
Less than 10 is calm. We can fly and up to we can launch in say 15 or so 16
knots, I presume.
Knots, yeah. And then in the air, once you're in the air, you can kind of go. It doesn't really matter as long as there's not a shear level. The shear can get a little dangerous because it can it can collapse a balloon if it's too strong. But the fastest I've gone, I flew 140 miles across Ohio, and that I hit a top speed of 65 miles an hour.
Oh, wow.
On that flight. But people on those type of flights, people regularly get over 100 miles an hour. And the balloons that went around the world were in the jet stream, and they were going, however fast the jet stream goes.
Right. I was going to say the only other time I've read about ballooning was Richard Branson's exploits.
Yeah.
Back in the day trying to do that.
Yeah. So they flew all those in the jet stream at, between 20 and 30,000 feet. So
wow,
they were really smoking.
Yeah.
But so, calm winds less than an ideal is, 5 to 10 knots and launch and landing. And at that level, even up to, 12 or 14 knots, you could sort of kind of come in. You might, at the higher wind speed there, you might bounce a little bit until the balloon loses its momentum. And then you just sort of kind of come to a stop on the ground.
Okay, cool. What's the best charter trip you've ever scheduled?
The best charter trip, or
the most difficult.
There are, oh man, there's a lot
of
difficult ones. The most interesting one is probably we did a music group across Canada. They did just a short tour, but they played in places like Yellowknife, way up there in the Northern Territories. So that was interesting to sort of. It's always interesting to deal with that sort of dynamic, music group or somebody that's on tour, but to do it in the sort of those locations. And I think it was a surprise. I think it was almost like they were having flash concerts when they landed.
Right.
So that was cool. That was really cool to be part of.
Very cool. All right. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to do this, Joe. Really enjoyed it. Any final advice for those thinking about working in aviation or some young people just getting into aviation?
Well, I would say, having a strong work ethic and not being afraid to do what other people maybe don't want to do has served me well. So don't be afraid to sort of put your time in that way, because it has paid off for me at least.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks so much for being on.
Yeah, thank you, Graham.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Just a reminder, you can find show notes, links to everything we talked about, and more at leansystems.co/blog. And I would encourage you to sign up for our email list to make sure you get notified about new blog posts and podcasts. See you next time.